These are a selection of dramatized readings meant to align with the Marx-Engels reader, pages 760 to 768, although the text was sourced from alternate translations found on Marxists.org. You may see some slight derivations from the book. One should note that the selections within the reader are often not the entire letters, but snippets that the editor found especially relevant. Please also note that the Marx-Engels reader misattributed the third letter's recipient to an H. Starkenberg, whereas the true addressee is believed to be Walther Borgius, a German economist and anarchic theorist. To support your work, I have followed the Marx-Engels reader's editor's direction, but I'd encourage anyone to source and read the full text for themselves for a greater appreciation of the context surrounding them. To that end, Marxist.org is a fantastic resource. Here we have 3 letters written by Frederick Engels in the waning years of his life. These letters are exemplary of his efforts to help guide the public reception of Das Kapital, to try to clear up the all too often narrow readings of such an expansive work. Among the key concepts he worked to clarify were the position and framing of ideology, and the tendencies for many to see in Marx's theory a form of determinism which was never intended. I will use this voice to indicate the beginnings of each letter and will turn to the voice of this channel's creator, the Mad Adam, as the voice of Frederick Engels. This first letter was written in London, on September 21st to 22nd, 1890.
To Joseph Bloch, according to the materialist conception of history, the ultimately determining element in history is the production and reproduction of real life. Other than this, neither Marx nor I have ever asserted. Hence, if somebody twists this into saying that the economic element is the only determining one, he transforms that proposition into a meaningless, abstract, senseless phrase. The economic situation is the basis, but the various elements of the superstructure, political forms of the class struggle and its results, to wit, constitutions established by the victorious class after a successful battle, etc., juridical forms, and even the reflexes of all these actual struggles in the brains of the participants, political, juristic, philosophical theories, religious views, and their further development into systems of dogmas, also exercise their influence upon the course of the historical struggles and in many cases preponderate in determining their form. There is an interaction of all these elements in which, amid all the endless host of accidents, that is, of things and events whose interconnection is so remote or so impossible of proof that we can regard it as non-existent, as negligible, the economic movement finally asserts itself as necessary. Otherwise, the application of the theory to any period of history would be easier than the solution of a simple equation of the first degree. We make our history ourselves, but, in the first place, under very definite assumptions and conditions. Among these, the economic ones are ultimately decisive, but the political ones, etc., and indeed even the traditions which haunt human minds also play a part, although not the decisive one. The Prussian state also arose and developed from historical, ultimately economic, causes, but it could scarcely be maintained without pedantry that among the many small states of North Germany, Brandenburg was specifically determined by economic necessity to become the great power embodying the economic, linguistic, and, after the Reformation, also the religious difference between North and South, and not by other elements as well, above all by its entanglement with Poland, owing to the possession of Prussia, and hence with international political relations, which were indeed also decisive in the formation of the Austrian dynastic power. Without making oneself ridiculous, it would be a difficult thing to explain in terms of economics the existence of every small state in Germany, past and present, or the origin of the High German consonant permutations, which widen the geographic partition wall formed by the mountains from the Sudetic range to the Taunus to form a regular fissure across all Germany. In the second place, however, history is made in such a way that the final result always arises from conflicts between many individual wills, of which each in turn has been made what it is by a host of particular conditions of life. Thus there are innumerable intersecting forces, an infinite series of parallelograms of forces which give rise to one resultant, the historical event. This may again itself be viewed as the product of a power which works as a whole unconsciously and without volition, for what each individual wills is obstructed by everyone else, and what emerges is something that no one willed. Thus history has proceeded hitherto in the manner of a natural process and is essentially subject to the same laws of motion. But from the fact that the wills of individuals, each of whom desires what he is impelled to by his physical constitution and external, in the last resort economic, circumstances, either his own personal circumstances or those of society in general, do not attain what they want, but are merged into an aggregate mean, a common resultant, it must not be concluded that they are equal to zero. On the contrary, each contributes to the resultant and is to this extent included in it. I would furthermore ask you to study this theory from its original sources and not at second hand. It is really much easier. Marx hardly wrote anything in which it did not play a part. but especially the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte is a most excellent example of its application. There are also many allusions to it in Kapital. Then may I also direct you to my writings, Herr Eugen Düring's Revolution in Science and Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, in which I have given the most detailed account of historical materialism which, as far as I know, exists. Marx and I are ourselves partly to blame for the fact that the younger people sometimes lay more stress on the economic side than is due to it. We had to emphasize the main principle vis-a-vis our adversaries, who denied it, and we had not always the time, the place, or the opportunity to give their due to the other elements involved in the interaction. But when it came to presenting a section of history, that is, to making a practical application, it was a different matter and there no error was permissible. Unfortunately, however, it happens only too often that people think they have fully understood a new theory and can apply it without more ado from the moment they have assimilated its main principles, and even those not always correctly. And I cannot exempt many of the more recent Marxists from this reproach, for the most amazing rubbish has been produced in this quarter, too. The reaction of the state power upon economic development can be one of three kinds. It can run in the same direction, and then development is more rapid. It can oppose the line of development, in which case nowadays state power and every great people will go to pieces in the long run, or it can cut off the economic development from certain paths and prescribe certain others. This case ultimately reduces itself to one of the two previous ones. But it is obvious that in cases 2 and 3, the political power can do great damage to the economic development and result in the squandering of great masses of energy and material. Then there is also the case of the conquest and brutal destruction of economic resources, by which, in certain circumstances, a whole local or national economic development could formally be ruined. Nowadays such a case usually has the opposite effect, at least among great peoples. In the long run the vanquished often gains more economically, politically and morally than the victor. Similarly with law. As soon as the new division of labor which creates professional lawyers becomes necessary, another new and independent sphere is opened up which, for all its general dependence on production and trade, still has also a special capacity for reacting upon these spheres. In a modern state, law must not only correspond to the general economic condition and be its expression, but must also be an internally coherent expression which does not, owing to inner contradictions, reduce itself to naught. And in order to achieve this, the faithful reflection of economic conditions suffers increasingly. All the more so the more rarely it happens that a code of law is the blunt, unmitigated, unadulterated expression of the domination of a class. This in itself would offend the conception of right. Even in the Code Napoleon, the pure, consistent conception of right held by the revolutionary bourgeoisie of 1792 to 1796 is already adulterated in many ways, and, insofar as it is embodied there, has daily to undergo all sorts of attenuations owing to the rising power of the proletariat, which does not prevent the Code Napoleon from being the statute book which serves as a basis for every new code of law in every part of the world. Thus, to a great extent, the course of the development of right only consists, first, in the attempt to do away with the contradictions arising from the direct translation of economic relations into legal principles, and to establish a harmonious system of law, and then in the repeated breaches made in this system by the influence and pressure of further economic development, which involves it in further contradictions. I am speaking here only of civil law for the moment. The reflection of economic relations as legal principles is necessarily also a topsy-turvy one. It goes on without the person who is acting being conscious of it. The jurist imagines he is operating with a priori propositions, whereas they are really only economic reflexes, so everything is upside down. And it seems to me obvious that this inversion, which, so long as it remains unrecognized, forms what we call ideological conception, reacts in its turn upon the economic basis and may, within certain limits, modify it. The basis of the law of inheritance, assuming that the stages reached in the development of the family are equal, as an economic one. Nevertheless, it would be difficult to prove, for instance, that the absolute liberty of the testator.
A testator is a person who has died and left a valid will.
In England, and the severe restrictions imposed upon him in France are only due in every detail to economic causes. Both react back, however, on the economic sphere to a very considerable extent, because they influence the distribution of property. As to the realms of ideology which soar still higher in the air, religion, philosophy, etc., these have a prehistoric stock, found already in existence by, and taken over in, the historic period, of what we should today call bunk. These various false conceptions of nature, of man's own being, of spirits, magic forces, etc., have for the most part only a negative economic basis. The low economic development of the prehistoric prehistoric period is supplemented and also partially conditioned and even caused by the false conceptions of nature. And even though economic necessity was the main driving force of the progressive knowledge of nature and becomes ever more so, it would surely be pedantic to try and find economic causes for all this primitive nonsense. The history of science is the history of the gradual clearing away of this nonsense or of its replacement by fresh but always less absurd nonsense. The people who attend to this belong in their turn to special spheres in the division of labor and appear to themselves to be working in an independent field, and to the extent that they form an independent group within the social division of labor, their productions, including their errors, react back as an influence upon the whole development of society, even on its economic development. But all the same they themselves are again under the dominating influence of economic development. In philosophy, for instance, this can be most readily proved for the bourgeois period. Hobbes was the first modern materialist, in the 18th century sense, but he was an absolutist in a period when absolute monarchy was at its height throughout the whole of Europe and when the fight of absolute monarchy versus the people was beginning in England. Locke, both in religion and politics, was the child of the class compromise of 1688. The English deists and their more consistent continuators, the French materialists, were the true philosophers of the bourgeoisie, the French even of the bourgeois revolution. The German Philistine runs through German philosophy from Kant to Hegel, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively. But the philosophy of every epoch, since it is a definite sphere in the division of labor, has as its presupposition certain definite thought material handed down to it by its predecessors, from which it takes its start. And that is why economically backward countries can still play first fiddle in philosophy. France in the 18th century compared with England, on whose philosophy the French based themselves, and later Germany relatively to both. But in France as well as Germany, philosophy and the general blossoming of literature at that time were the result of a rising economic development. I consider the ultimate supremacy of economic development established in these spheres too, but it comes to pass within the conditions imposed by the particular sphere itself. In philosophy, for instance, through the operation of economic influences, which again generally act only under political, etc., disguises upon the existing philosophic material handed down by predecessors. Here economy creates nothing anew, but it determines the way in which the thought material found in existence is altered and further developed, and that too for the most part indirectly, for it is the political, legal, and moral reflexes which exercise the greatest direct influence upon philosophy. About religion I have said what was most necessary in the last section on Feuerbach. If therefore Barth supposes that we deny any and every reaction of the political, etc., reflexes of the economic movement upon the movement itself, he is simply tilting at windmills. He has only got to look at Marx's 18th Brumaire, which deals almost exclusively with the particular part played by political struggles and events, of course within their general dependence upon economic conditions. Or Kapital, the section on the working day, for instance, where legislation, which is surely a political act, has such a trenchant effect. Or the section on the history of the bourgeoisie. Chapter 24. Or why do we fight for the political dictatorship of the proletariat if political power is economically impotent? Force, that is, state power, is also an economic power. But I have no time to criticize the book now. I must first get volume 3 out. And besides, I think that Bernstein, for instance, could deal with it quite effectively. What these gentlemen all lack is dialectics. They always see only here cause, their effect. That this is a hollow abstraction. That such metaphysical polar opposites exist in the real world only during crises, while the whole vast process goes on in the form of interaction, though of very unequal forces, the economic movement being by far the strongest, most primeval, most decisive, that here everything is relative and nothing absolute. This they never begin to see. Hegel has never existed for them.
This next letter was written in London on July 14, 1893, and addressed
To Franz Mehring. Today is my first opportunity to thank you for the Lessing legend you were kind enough to send me. I did not want to reply with a bare formal acknowledgement of receipt of the book, but intended at the same time to tell you something about it, about its contents. Hence the delay. I shall begin at the end, the appendix on historical materialism, in which you have described the main things excellently and for any unprejudiced person convincingly. If I find anything to object to it is that you attribute more credit to me than I deserve, even if I count in everything which I might possibly have found out for myself in time, but which Marx with his more rapid coup d'oeil, grasp, and wider vision discovered much more quickly. When one has the good fortune to work for 40 years with a man like Marx, one does not usually get the recognition one thinks one deserves during his lifetime. Then if the greater man dies, the lesser easily gets overrated, and this seems to me to be just my case at present. History will set all this right in the end, and by that time one will be safely round the corner and know nothing more about anything. Otherwise there is only one other point lacking, which, however, Marx and I always failed to stress enough in our writings and in regard to which we are all equally guilty. That is to say, we all lay, and were bound to lay, the main emphasis, in the first place, on the derivation of political, juridical and other ideological notions, and of actions arising through the medium of these notions, from basic economic facts. But in so doing we neglected the formal side, the ways and means by which these notions, etc., come about, for the sake of the content. This has given our adversaries a welcome opportunity for misunderstandings, of which Paul Barth is a striking example. Ideology is a process accomplished by the so-called thinker consciously, indeed, but with a false consciousness. The real motives impelling him remain unknown to him. Otherwise it would not be an ideological process at all. Hence he imagines false or apparent motives. Because it is a process of thought, he derives both its form and its content from pure thought, either his own or that of his predecessors. He works with mere thought material, which he accepts without examination as the product of thought. He does not investigate further for a more remote process independent of thought. Indeed, its origin seems obvious to him, because as all action is produced through the medium of thought, it also appears to him to be ultimately based upon thought. The ideologist who deals with history is here simply meant to comprise all the spheres, political, juridical, philosophical, theological, belonging to society and not only to nature. The ideologist dealing with history, then, possesses in every sphere of science material which has formed itself independently out of the thought of previous generations and has gone through an independent series of developments in the brains of these successive generations. True, external facts belonging to its own or other spheres may have exercised a co-determining influence on this development, but the tacit presupposition is that these facts themselves are also only the fruits of a process of thought, and so we still remain within that realm of pure thought which has successfully digested the hardest facts. It is above all this appearance of an independent history of state constitutions, of systems of law, of ideological conceptions in every separate domain, which dazzles most people. If Luther and Calvin overcome the official Catholic religion, or Hegel overcomes Fichte and Kant, or if the constitutional Montesquieu is indirectly overcome by Rousseau with his social contract, each of these events remains within the sphere of theology, philosophy, or political science, represents a stage in the history of these particular spheres of thought, and never passes outside the sphere of thought. And since the bourgeois illusion of the eternity and the finality of capitalist production has been added as well, even the victory of the physiocrats and Adam Smith over the mercantilists is accounted as a sheer victory of thought, not as the reflection in thought of changed economic facts, but as the finally achieved correct understanding of actual conditions subsisting always and everywhere. In fact, if Richard Coeur de Lion and Philip Augustus had introduced free trade instead of getting mixed up in the Crusades, we should have been spared 500 years of misery and stupidity. This side of the matter, which I can only indicate here, we have all, I think, neglected more than it deserves. It is the old story. Form is always neglected at first for content. As I say, I have done that too, and the mistake has always only struck me later. So I am not only far from reproaching you with this in any way, but as the older of the guilty parties I have no right to do so, on the contrary. But I would like all the same to draw your attention to this point for the future. Hanging together with this too is the fatuous notion of the ideologists, that because we deny an independent historical development to the various ideological spheres which play a part in history, we also deny them any effect upon history. The basis of this is the common and dialectical conception of cause and effect as rigidly opposite poles, the total disregarding of interaction. These gentlemen often almost deliberately forget that once an historic element has been brought into the world by other elements, ultimately by economic facts, it also reacts in its turn and may react on its environment and even on its own causes.
This final letter was written in London on January 25, 1894 and addressed
to Walther Borgius. Men make their history themselves, but not as yet with a collective will or according to a collective plan or even in a definitely defined, given society. Their efforts clash, and for that very reason all such societies are governed by necessity, which is supplemented by and appears under the forms of accident. The necessity which here asserts itself amidst all accident is again ultimately economic necessity. This is where the so-called great men come in for treatment. That such and such a man and precisely that man arises at that particular time in that given country is of course pure accident. But cut him out and there will be a demand for a substitute, and this substitute will be found, good or bad, but in the long run he will be found. That Napoleon, just that particular Corsican, should have been the military dictator whom the French Republic, exhausted by its own war, had rendered necessary, was an accident, but that, if a Napoleon had been lacking, another would have filled the place, is proved by the fact that the man has always been found as soon as he became necessary. Caesar, Augustus, Cromwell, etc. While Marx discovered the materialist conception of history, Thierry, Meunier, Guizot, and all the English historians up to 1850 are the proof that it was being striven for, and the discovery of the same conception by Morgan proves that the time was ripe for it, and that indeed it had to be discovered. So with all the other accidents, and apparent accidents, of history. The further the particular sphere which we are investigating is removed from the economic sphere and approaches that of pure abstract ideology, the more shall we find it exhibiting accidents in its development. The more will its curve run in a zigzag. So also you will find that the axis of this curve will approach more and more nearly parallel to the axis of the curve of economic development the longer the period considered and the wider the field dealt with.
This was a selection of dramatized readings meant to align with the Marx-Engels reader pages 760 to 768, although the text was sourced from alternate translations found on Marxists.org. This work was done primarily to support a cohort of doctoral students as they pursue their degrees in sociology. It is my hope that this work is helpful to anyone pursuing a deeper understanding of these concepts that might otherwise be had through second-hand receipt of opinions. Thank you for your labor and your attention.